Hello and welcome to lecture number 5 for Between War and Peace. This week we're going to be looking at non-violence and pacifism. Last week we explored diplomacy, focusing particularly on the case for diplomatic criticism, whether it's permissible to engage in diplomatic criticism when one is hypocritical, as well as mediation and the cutting of diplomatic ties. Now this week we're going to focus on various non-violent measures, and particularly on two main measures, civilian defense and peacekeeping. In the third part of today's lecture, we're going to consider non-violence and pacifism and some of the arguments for and against pacifism more generally. So today's lecture is going to be split into three parts. In the first part, we're going to look at non-violence in general and the case for one measure, civilian defense. In the second part, we're going to look at the case for unarmed civilian peacekeeping. And the third part of today's lecture, we're going to look at pacifism. Now, I want to admit to you that when I first started researching into non-violence with this project that I've been engaged in, I was pretty skeptical. My research had previously looked at humanitarian intervention and war. And unlike pacifists, I think the humanitarian intervention and war can sometimes be justified. Indeed, I published books and articles that argue as much. So I've always been fairly skeptical of pacifist arguments for non-violence. The other options that we looked at so far, war, diplomacy, sanctions, have all involved some form of coercion. Now, there is a clear reason why we might think that these arguments work. These measures work. They impose direct costs on those who are committing atrocities or aggression. So if they don't stop engaging in atrocities or engaging in aggression, they'll be subject to sanctions or subject to diplomatic criticism, cutting of diplomatic ties, or potentially they'll be subject to military intervention or war. So on the face of it, I thought that non-violence wasn't going to work. And this is because at first sight, and I want to reiterate, this is at first sight, it doesn't seem to impose costs on the same way. So there's no reason for those who are involved in aggression, those who are involved in mass atrocities to stop their behavior. But as I went on in my research, I found that there's a lot more going on for non-violence than it first seems. And in particular, it can impose indirect costs. And this is what we're going to explore today. Perhaps the most famous non-violent movement was led by Mahatma Gandhi in his campaign for Indian independence. He coined the term satyagraha. For Gandhi, non-violence was not passive, but active. So this term was used to demarcate passivity from active resistance. This term, satyagraha. Now, Gandhi's legacy in turn influenced the civil rights movement in the US, led by Martin Luther King. And more recently, there were popular uprisings in Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine. Some of the revolutions in the Arab Spring in 2011, in Tunisia and Egypt have used non-violent methods, as have some of the other recent non-violent movements, such as in Belarus. Now, many of these revolutions were influenced by the work of Gene Sharp, who we're going to look at today. Sharp's most famous works are in 3 volumes. The Politics of Nonviolent Actions. They've got 3 volumes. Now, this is in the library. As you can see, I've listed the details there. Now, I've also found it online. If you just Google it, it's on the website, a whole PDF. In these volumes, Sharp considers how nonviolence can work before, in part 2, listing 198 different nonviolent methods. Now, most of these 198 methods are focused on forms of resisting government oppression. They range from various forms of strikes, boycotts, marches, to mock funerals, and disguising identities of secret agents. They are essentially manuals for non-violent movements. Sharp's work led him to being nominated 4 times for the Nobel Peace Prize, and there's also a film about him, the trailer of which is here.
My name is Gene Sharp, and this is the work I do.
This is a technique of combat. It is a substitute for war and other violence.
As we speak, somebody is doing it in Iran. As we speak, somebody is doing it in Egypt. As we speak, somebody is doing it in Venezuela. I'm telling you the facts I know.
To be counted as a threat to a tyrant is a matter of pride, I would say. It means we're effective. It means we're relevant. It means out of this very small office, we produce work that threatens regimes.
Gene Sharp's tactics and theories are being practiced on the streets of Syria as we speak now.
It shows that what Gene was talking about year after year after year, there are realistic alternatives to violent conflict.
Unless they have something instead of violence and war, they will go back with violence and war every time.
If you're interested, I've put the link for the video to Vimeo, the website Vimeo, where you can purchase it on Blackboard. It's called How to Start a Revolution, in case you missed it. Now, then, according to advocates of nonviolence, nonviolent methods work. And they claim that they work better than violent ones, contrary to much public opinion. How do they work? A central notion is what Sharp calls political jujitsu. This concerns the process by which violence deals with non-violence. According to Sharp, if you use violence against violence, there will often be little uproar, sorry. Violent responses can also harm innocents and disenfranchise those who don't want to get involved, everyday citizens who don't want to get involved in violent campaigns. There's also far less sympathy, typically internationally, for violent rebellions. But if you use non-violence, you're much more likely to get support. Violence by an authoritarian government against non-violent groups is much more likely to delegitimize the oppressors than if it were against violent groups. So non-violent groups, Sharp argues, are much more likely to get international support given the brutal crackdown in response to them. And at the same time, the victim's cause will be viewed more favorably. Consequently, to quote Sharp, their non-violence helps the opponent's repression to throw him off politically. The non-violent group is also able to gain far more support and power than if it had met violence with violence. As violent groups become aware of these effects, they may become less willing to use force in the first place, out of fear of repercussions. They will need to maintain international support and don't want to be seen as pariahs. The apparent success of non-violence has been documented recently in the influential work of Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, whose work is on the reading list this week. And this focuses on civil resistance movements. Stephan and Chenoweth find that major non-violent campaigns are 6 times more likely to be successful than violent campaigns facing repression. Why is this? Well, I've already said that non-violent movements are often seen as more legitimate. This can not only lead to increased international support, it can also increase participation rates in the non-violent movement. If you engage in non-violent rebellion, potential supporters will be put off as they don't want to go to war. They don't want to kill their compatriots and might not trust rebel leaders. By contrast, using non-violence can significantly increase participation rates. It can mean that thousands and even millions more civilians take part in the movement, which increases its political importance. In addition, they argue that when the repressive regime uses non-violence against non-violent movements, this can lead to dissension within the regime. Some of those within the regime will object to killing the harming of their compatriots, and sometimes they may defect. By contrast, it's much easier to justify using violence to yourself, to your family and friends, when the other side is using violence. So, to repeat, according to non-violent advocates, the method of political jiu-jitsu works by wielding political power to decrease international support for the regime and increase support for the victims, which can at times be far greater than when using violent measures. And according to Stephan and Chenoweth's influential study, non-violent methods are 6 times more likely to be successful. Interestingly, non-violence even works in Fortnite.
Today, as you may tell from the title, I succeeded in the pacifist style. This is the story of how I said no to violence, winning a solo victory with 0 kills, 0 building, and 0 shots fired. At the grass and trying to stay calm. I'm very stressed. 2. Oh my god. And this was the moment it happened. This is my victory royale.
More seriously, Erica Chenoweth, who's become something of an academic superstar, recorded a TED Talk, which is here, first minute or 2.
I'd like you to imagine that you live in a really repressive country. There are elections, but they're fake. The leader wins 100% of the vote each time. Security forces beat up opposition leaders with impunity, and they harass everyone else. This is a country where being in this room right now would get you on a list. Now let's say you've had enough, and so have many other people that you talk with in low whispers. Now I'm not talking about the Hunger Games, although that would be awesome. Unfortunately, I'm talking about real-world conditions that many people face right now. So assuming you've decided to act, what would be the best way for you to challenge the system and create something new? My own answer to this question has changed over the past few years. In 2006, I was a PhD student here at CU Boulder studying political science, and my dissertation was on how and why people use violence to create political change in their countries. As for the scenario I just described, Well, back then I bought into the idea that power flows from the barrel of a gun. And what I would have said was that although it was tragic, it was logical in such situations for people to use violence to seek their change. But then I was invited to an academic workshop put on by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. They were giving a week-long primer on nonviolent resistance to try to get people like me to teach about it in our classes. Now, my view of all of this at the time was that it was well-intentioned but dangerously naive. I mean, the readings they sent me in advance argued that the best way for people to seek really difficult political changes was through nonviolent or civil resistance. They described civil resistance as an active form of conflict where unarmed civilians would use tactics like protests, boycotts, demonstrations, and lots of other forms of mass non-cooperation to seek change. They brought up cases like Serbia, where a nonviolent revolution toppled Slobodan Milosevic, the butcher of the Balkans, in October of 2000, and the Philippines, where the People Power movement ousted Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. At the workshop, I said stuff like, well, those were probably exceptions. For every successful case you guys bring up, I can think of a failed case like Tiananmen Square. I can also think of plenty of cases where violence worked pretty well, like the Russian, French, and Algerian revolutions. Maybe nonviolent resistance works if you're seeking environmental reforms, gender rights, labor rights, but it can't work generally if you're trying to overthrow a dictator or become a new country. And it definitely can't work if the authoritarian leader you're facing is not incompetent, is somebody who's really brutal and ruthless. So by the end of the week, as you can imagine, I wasn't very popular. But my soon-to-be co-author, Maria Stefan, came up to me and said something like, if you're right, why don't you prove it? Are you curious enough to study this in a serious way empirically? Now, believe it or not, nobody had really done that before systematically. And although I was still skeptical, I was curious. I figured that if they were right and I was wrong, somebody better find out. So for the next 2 years, I collected data on all major nonviolent and violent campaigns for the overthrow of a government or territorial liberation since 1900. The data covered the entire world and consist of every known case where there were at least 1,000 observed participants. This is hundreds of cases. Then I analyzed the data, and the results blew me away. From 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent insurgencies. And there's more. This trend has been increasing over time, so that in the last 50 years, nonviolent campaigns are becoming increasingly successful and common, whereas violent insurgencies are becoming increasingly rare and unsuccessful. This is true even in those extremely brutal authoritarian conditions where I expected nonviolent resistance to fail.
So that's the basic theory behind nonviolence. I should add that Sharp, Stefan and Chenoweth's work focuses primarily on nonviolent ways of resisting domestically. That is nonviolent ways of resisting your own repressive government. Today, we're going to focus on nonviolent methods of resisting externally. That is, resisting oppressors or those engaged in mass atrocities beyond your borders or those that are trying to invade you. And we're going to focus on two measures. As I've said, civilian defense, going to look at it in just a second. And in part two, we're going to look at nonviolent peacekeeping. So civilian defense is using non-violent methods to defend yourself against aggression. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping is using unarmed civilian peacekeepers, non-violence beyond your borders. Let's start with civilian defense then. So this is, as I've said, a way of various non-violent means of resisting aggressors, for instance, that are trying to invade you or trying to be aggressive. It's using these methods rather than using an army. You might see it as national defense without the military. Defenders of civilian defense say that civilian defense even worked against Nazi rule in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. But perhaps the clearest example of its use was in Lithuania in 1991, in the process of Lithuanian attempts to gain independence from the USSR. In one incident, Soviet troops killed 14 people and injured 702 who were attempting to protect the television tower. Instead of using violence back, Lithuanian citizens continued their non-violent movement. Civilians surrounded strategically important objects, such as the buildings of the Supreme Council and the Transmission and Radio Center. In late 1991, the USSR withdrew its troops and international recognition was granted to Lithuania. So suppose that, for instance, the UK were to scrap its army. Would it be vulnerable to attack? Well, first of all, defenders of non-violence would argue that even if it didn't have an army, the UK isn't likely to be attacked. Who would attack? France? The claim then is that there aren't many potential aggressors out there. There's not much to attack. There's not many who want to attack, but suppose still there is someone that wants to attack the UK. Would civilian defence work? Gene Sharp's book, Civilian-Based Defence, which is one of the potential required readings this week, it's a short book, provides the most systematic account. According to Sharp, civilian defence can, firstly, deter aggressors from attacking in the first place, and secondly, even if deterrence fails, can make it much harder for the aggressor to achieve what they want to. So, according to Sharp, the focus of civilian defence is first, deterrence. This requires the building of capacity of civilian defence. It is showing that civilians can defend themselves and then discourage potential aggressors. Secondly, civilian defence involves resisting an occupying force primarily by using non-cooperation and defiance. Measures include boycotts, strikes, protests, paralysing transportation, economic shutdowns, denials of legitimacy, and general inefficiency. It's making it extremely hard to run the country. Gandhi famously argued that no government can exist for a single moment without the cooperation of people, willing or forced. And if people suddenly withdraw their cooperation in every detail, the government will come to a standstill. If the aggressors try to use violence against these methods, the political jiu-jitsu effects will come in and increase support amongst the resistors. And this makes it even harder, Sharp argues, for the aggressors to implement their policies. Sharp adds a further point. This concerns the existence of militaries. As it stands, he argues, the presence of current militaries often exacerbates tensions, such as through undermining trust and increasing security measures, and leads to arms races and what's in international relations called the security dilemma, where states compete against each other for security. In other words, states compete to get better weapons. But, he argues, with civilian defence, there would be fewer wars and acts of aggression in the first place, as the process of disarmament and demilitarization would engender better relations with other states. Similarly, Dwayne Cady, pacifist that we'll look at shortly, argues that a country trained in and dependent on civilian defense, a country without massive conventional nuclear weapons and armies, is far less likely to be feared by other countries as a potential invader, and will be far less likely then to be targeted by them. So the worry then is about the external dangers of having an army. Having an army makes it, in fact, more likely that you will be subject to attack. There's a final benefit that I want to highlight that Sharp presents of civilian defense, potential benefit. He argues that militaries are often dangerous towards their own state. Even in liberal democracies, there arises worries about the fact that the military will interfere in domestic political issues. So although not a rights-based democracy, we saw a few years ago, there was a major coup attempt in Turkey. There was also a recent coup in Mali. Even if there's not a coup, the military still might put significant pressure and make significant influence, have a significant influence on the domestic politics of the state. More precisely, the issue is that there will be fraught civil and military relations. And in particular, the military may prey on the society that it's meant to protect. Coups and military rule is one extreme, but it might, perhaps less extreme, simply deny democratic rule and involve itself in conflicts contrary to the express will of the state or leaders. So it might drag the state into conflicts, or it might refuse to be subject to civilian rule, or it might interfere with domestic politics. For instance, in 2015, The Times published an interview with the serving general of the UK Armed Forces, and he said this: if Jeremy Corbyn is elected and tries to scrap Trident, pull out of NATO, or shrink the size of the armed forces, there would be mutiny. Now, regardless of whether the general was bluffing or not, the response at the time was that this was a clear attempt of the military to influence British politics and that the military should stay out of it. So Sharp's argument here is that scrapping the military could potentially remove corrosive and often dangerous institution for democracy and for human rights within states. Now, this is an interesting idea, this idea of civilian defense, but there's an obvious worry. The famous just war theorist Michael Walzer, we looked at in week 2, argues that although it might work if the aggressor cares about human rights and their reputations, it seems far less likely to work against a ruthless occupier and regime. Barack Obama, in his Nobel Peace Prize speech, we've seen a couple of times already in this course, argues that a non-violent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. What then about the cases of resistance to the Nazis cited by defenders of civilian defense? Brian Arend argues that the non-violent resistance movements in Sweden, Norway, Denmark against the Nazis were not really successful, since they happened after Hitler had conquered these lands. They didn't stop the invasion, Arend argues. And if the Nazis had have considered them a serious threat to their control, they would have crushed them. Although the resistance, non-violent resistance, did cause some problems for the Nazi rulers, according to Arend, it was ultimately not significant in rolling back of aggression. This, Arend argues, depended on the military action by the Allies. So the claim is that civilian defense won't work if the aggressor is ruthless. Now, I should say here that these claims are also contested and responded to by a piece by Ralph Summey that's on the reading list. Another problem raised against civilian defense by Walzer is that it asks too much of civilians to sustain the battle, given all the repercussions that they will have to bear when the ruthless aggressor kills, maims, and oppresses them. It's too much to ask of them as civilians to maintain non-violent resistance, civilian defense in the face of a ruthless oppressor that's really responding very harsh, cracking down really strongly. Now, there are a few points to note about this critique. First, it doesn't challenge fully the case for non-violent national defense. It says only that non-violence will sometimes work. But Cady argues that this is also true of violent action. violence has frequently failed to stop invasion against a ruthless aggressor. Secondly, even if one holds that military force is sometimes required against ruthless aggressors, it might still seem to hold that non-violent national defence should be undertaken alongside it as well. Guerrilla war and more direct armed confrontation should be partnered with boycotts, protests, and other forms of non-cooperation. At issue then, it's not the question of whether civilian defence is a suitable option to undertake on occasion, but rather whether it should be the sole measure. Can states solely rely on non-violent national defence instead of using military force? This is an interesting question. You might think that for some states this is possible. It seems largely to depend on how likely they are to be subject to military invasion. It also depends on whether there are collective security arrangements with other states that do have powerful military capacity and can come to the aid of the state. Give you a quick example. Costa Rica. Costa Rica doesn't have an official army. It abolished it in 1948. It does have military trained police, but it doesn't have an official army. What happens if Costa Rica is attacked? Well, in the case of war, the US has agreed to offer assistance to Costa Rica. It signed the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, which is a collective security arrangement. Is this genuine civilian defense? Well, non-violent national defense might be thought of not doing the work in protecting Costa Rica. It might be thought that it's the military capacity of other states, most notably the US. On the other hand, one might think that this is still a significant case where there has been disarmament and civilian national defense is a plausible option. A second related worry is this: national civilian defense is focused on trying to defend the state from invasion and occupation. It's all about making it harder to rule the country. What happens if the aggressors aren't interested in ruling the country? They might have other goals, such as annexation of part of the territory, securing economic resources, such as access to natural resources, or regime change. It's far less clear in these cases how national civilian defense could work, given that the whole point of national civilian defense is to make occupation very difficult. Two final clarifications for civilian defense before we end part one. Firstly, it's important to note that in his account of civilian-based defense, Sharp somewhat anticipates these worries. He's very careful not to exaggerate the potential for civilian defense to work in the more extreme cases of mass atrocities and annexation. Secondly, it's important to highlight that this critique is about responses to foreign aggressors. That is, where your state is threatened by another. It doesn't deny that non-violence can work against internal repression. Indeed, the effectiveness of internal civil resistance seems likely to be higher because domestic leaders are more likely to be influenced by reputational pressures to treat their own citizens well. Foreign aggressors, it seems, are less likely to be concerned by such reputational pressures to treat other civilians well, to treat others beyond their borders well. This, again, is simply because they won't need to govern the population subject to their aggression. Okay, in part one, then we've seen the general case for non-violent measures related to the notion of political jiu-jitsu, and we focused on one potential measure, civilian defense. In part two, we're going to turn to a second measure, unarmed civilian peacekeeping.